Hello once again, students. We're going to wrap up topic 8, looking at post-war America by examining the prosperity and problems of the 1950s. So a lot of the changes that we looked at in lesson 4, as well as the advances in technology and science, looking at how that is creating this economic boom and a lot of the prosperity of the 50s, but also many of the problems, some of which are created by these changes, others which are still persisting from previous eras. Demobilization, innovation, the Cold War, these are all shaping the post-war economy. This is, again, one of the most prosperous times in American history. Although immediately after World War II, we saw a huge spike in inflation as high as 18%. While 18% was the average, some things went up much, much higher. The price of beef, for example, because government price controls and rationing were removed after the war was over. And so there was this big increase in demand as people went out to buy all of these things, which caused a huge spike in prices. But it also meant that unemployment would remain low. Advances in technology and in manufacturing, as mentioned before, this is going to make America the most productive nation in the world. 50% of the world's productive output comes from the United States alone. And Americans were enjoying the highest standard of living of anywhere in the world. The median family income had doubled since the 1920s. Military spending and continued advancements and research on the military end as we try to compete with the Soviet Union in the Cold War is going to lead to a lot of new technologies and materials, new metal alloys and that sort of thing. And the American corporations are becoming multinationals. GM, IBM, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is still one of the most recognized brand names anywhere you go in the world because these corporations have become international, and many of them, located first in the United States. Another form of business seeing a lot more popularity in the 1950s is the franchise, like this McDonald's. This may be the original McDonald's in the picture here. And a franchise is, an individual business owner owns that particular store or restaurant, but they franchise the brand. And with it, you have to meet certain quality standards and price standards and that sort of thing. So places like Holiday Inns and McDonald's, no matter where you go, you'll have very similar menus, almost the same thing. The prices will be relatively the same, and the quality, even if the quality is overall crappy, will remain the same too. And this provided a way for a lot of Americans to get into business ownership. But then there were a lot of American entrepreneurs like Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, who will found their own businesses to take advantage of this rapidly increasing consumerism in the United States. The American workforce is going to adapt to these changes as well. And the GI Bill of Rights, as mentioned before, is going to allow a lot of Americans to go to college, and this is going to feed this growing white-collar segment of the economy, particularly the service sector, areas where they, rather than providing a product, they provide a service. This would include like law, retail, healthcare, banking, insurance, and that sort of thing was the fastest growing segment of the economy. Computers, like this one seen here, ENIAC, one of the earliest computers, which actually the full size took up about the area of about 3 basketball courts and had less computing power than the phone in your pocket right now, is going to change the workforce and create more jobs in the information industries. Women, like the mathematician seen here working on the computer, remained in the workforce. And even though a lot of women went home or went back to sort of the traditional housewife role after World War II, many remained. And actually the number of women in the workforce will double by the 1960s, and women will account for about a third of the workforce. And this is necessary for a lot of families to maintain that middle class lifestyle that they had. Mechanical improvements to farm equipment, but also chemical breakthroughs in the areas of fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides is going to make farms far more productive, meaning one farmer can raise even more food and produce even more crops than other breakthroughs had made before. And the 1950s is sort of the height of the trade unions in the United States. And this is going to help to keep blue-collar wages high enough for many factory workers to live a middle-class lifestyle. But over time, after the 1950s, we'll see unions will start to decline. There are a couple of high-profile scandals in some of these union leaderships, financial scandals in groups like the Teamsters, as well as the fact that white-collar jobs don't tend to be union jobs in many cases. So the growing segment of the economy was a lot of areas that just did not usually unionize. In addition, Congress will pass the Taft-Hartley Act in the late 1940s, which will roll back some of the labor rights, like the closed shop, that had been gained during the New Deal. The American family in the 1950s and community life was sort of an attempt to retreat into the traditional, what was seen as traditional family values and structure, emphasizing the nuclear family as seen here: father, mother, and children. Many women were pressured to leave the workforce to become full-time homemakers. Child rearing, we started to see like experts like Dr. Spock, who emphasized nurturing children, kind of doting on children, which was a change from what we had seen in previous generations. Americans became more religious in this time. We start to see some of our first televangelists like Billy Graham. And part of this was us trying to set ourselves apart from the quote-unquote godless communists, as communism tended to be very atheistic. This is when we add in God we trust to our money and under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, neither of which was there from the beginning. Medical breakthroughs, vaccines, for diseases like polio and penicillin and other antibiotics are going to help us control these diseases and increase the life expectancy of Americans. And education is becoming more accessible. Many states started to require going to school through grade 12. A lot of states expanded on or created college university systems, most notably places like California and Texas will do this. And by the 1960s, 40% of college-age Americans were in college compared to the 15% near the end of World War II. The federal government is going to spend $1 billion supporting science education, as I mentioned before, in an effort to sort of keep up with the Soviets in something like the space race. And we do start to see school integration. Brown v. Board of Education, which we'll get more into the civil rights aspect of the 50s in the next topic. But Brown v. Board requiring school integration was 1954. But this is going to be slow going, so a lot of them will remain segregated. There's a lot of rejection of some of the ideals of the 1950s in this time, especially by young people as well as artists and intellectuals. And they're rejecting the consumerism and this really strong sense of conformity to a specific ideal in America. And part of that is fed in by the Cold War fears of, if you're too different, are you part of the enemy kind of thing that we saw with the Red Scare. They criticize that emphasis on the Cold War. We'll see writers like, books like Catcher in the Rye or The Feminine Mystique, which really emphasize the feelings of alienation, of being sort of left out when you don't fit that mold, that sort of narrow mold of what 1950s society expected out of people, like young people and women with The Feminine Mystique. There's groups of writers and artists referred to as beatniks, who openly rejected a lot of this conformity and promoted individualism. Rock and roll develops in the 1950s in many ways as sort of the music of rejection of this conformity, the music of rebellion. Musicians like Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, seen here, are going to bring African American rhythm and blues to a wider white audience, and it becomes the most popular music in the 1950s, which was scandalous, which seems tame by our standards now, but scandalous to many parents and religious leaders in the 1950s, the type of music and the way that people danced and that sort of thing. But it also showed the growing influence of youth and teenagers on mass media, that this rebellious music became the most popular music. Well, the growing suburbs tended to be an area of general prosperity in America. Poverty is going to remain a persistent problem, particularly in the inner cities and in the rural areas. And by some estimates, as many as a quarter of Americans in the 1950s actually lived in poverty. Part of this was the what's called white flight, the movement of whites out of the cities and into the suburbs. And as I mentioned before, FHA made it difficult for non-white people to get homes in the suburbs. And what this means is that wealthier, middle-class white Americans are able to move out of the cities, but as they go, their tax dollars go with them. They're no longer paying taxes to the cities, which means the cities can't provide the services that they normally would because they just don't have the money for that. So the inner city started to face housing shortages, their schools became underfunded, and crime rates started to go up because they couldn't afford policing and better schooling. Urban renewal projects attempted to alleviate some of this problem, housing projects as well, but they tend to have the effect of, with urban renewal projects, displacing people from their homes as they knock them down to build, highways and that sort of thing, or concentrating all the poverty and the problems along with it in smaller areas around these housing projects. In short, the American suburbs became whiter and richer, and the inner cities were becoming browner and poorer in the 1950s. Corporations and large farms are going to sort of push out the small farmers. A lot of them start to lose business or are unable to keep up. The improvements in fertilizers and machinery is going to eliminate a lot of work for many people. We just didn't need as many people in the agricultural business, and that's going to hurt a lot of rural Americans. And then, of course, coal miners like the men seen here in Appalachia, as well as sharecroppers in the South, just did not share in the growing prosperity of the 1950s. Minorities are going to continue to struggle with housing and employment discrimination. Puerto Ricans, many of whom moved to New York, ended up kind of stuck in the poorer barrio areas of the inner city and had limited access to political power because many of them didn't speak English. And so politicians didn't feel like they had to listen to these people. Mexican immigrants from the Bracero program, many of them who remained in America lived in, those who lived in the rural areas lived in these migrant camps and were exploited by their employers because of fear of being deported if they complained. And they were oftentimes treated just sort of as legal slave labor, as it was referred to sometimes. Operation Wetback, I kid you not, that is the name of it. It's actually where the slur comes from. Was a concerted effort by the Eisenhower administration to deport a lot of these people who had not been brought to, but immigrated to the United States, had been encouraged to immigrate to the United States during World War II as farm laborers. The termination policy is going to change the relationship of the United States government once again with the Native Americans. It ends the reservation system. It seeks to end tribal government and relocate American Indians to the cities. And the federal government will no longer take responsibility for their health and welfare as they had done when placing them on the reservations. And many were forced into poverty. But we will see that African Americans and others are going to start to push for civil rights. Graphic organizer this time is just a simple T-chart. Pick out examples of prosperity, examples of problems, put them on the appropriate side, about 8 to 10 of each.